The HTC One M8 is a phone that I've wanted to revisit for quite some time, as I still remember how special the release of this phone was. The One M8 is a phone that not only signified the end of HTC's mainstream popularity, but a shift in the industry to smartphones that we own now.
The One M8 is a follow-up to HTC One, retrospectively called the One M7. For a phone released in 2013, it was truly an innovator in the design department, such as with the prominent antenna lines, so prominent that when the iPhone 6 was released, it was named a copy of the HTC by quite a few tech folks. And this design inspired Chinese phone manufacturers for years to come, like with the iconic Redmi Note 4. Another innovative feature were the massive front-firing speakers. This was still during the days when phones either featured a rear-firing speaker or a single bottom-firing speaker, so a true stereo sound that faces you was quite a notable feature. HTC had followed these design trends onto the M8 while improving it, like adding dual-tone flash, a second camera for depth, and removing the capacitive buttons in the bezel onto on-screen ones. And let me tell you, this device is one of the best feeling phones in the hand. With the unibody aluminium frame wrapping around the phone and a natural curve on the back, it feels fantastic, and it's far less fragile than the glass sandwiches that you get on modern phones. The phone came in 3 colors: white, brushed black, and gold.
The phone came with a 5-inch 1080p Super LCD 3 panel,
which many criticized HTC for choosing over AMOLED back in the day, and with the 441 ppi and the lack of a pentile matrix array like on AMOLED, it means that this screen is incredibly sharp. And if you wanted something to cover it up, HTC's dot view case provided a faux dot matrix display, which I still think is one of the coolest cases of all time. HTC Sense was one of the best skins around. It's speedy, nowhere near as bloated as TouchWiz was, and features some nice touches. For example, you could download custom themes, or make your own, allowing you to change the app icons and the colors of the UI. The Sense UI redesign was during that transitional period between skeuomorphism and material design, and even to this day, this skin not only holds up, but it's also beautiful, with its single color panels, condensed fonts, and monochromatic UI icons. HTC has also left alone the core Android UI elements, like the Marshmallow-style quick settings panel. It was truly an upgrade against the stock Marshmallow UI, and don't worry, the flip clock is still here from days gone. The custom apps include a weather app with a background flying across a cloudy sky. The voice recorder app features a row of dots, reminiscent of the brown T3 transistor radio. Or how about the FM radio, which features the geometric style that was also popular back in the 2015-2016 era. Or the gallery app, which by default features a timeline view, as opposed to the all albums view, like many Android phones were doing at that time. Frankly, there aren't too many built-in apps to talk about, but my point is, HTC always did things a little differently, which while some people may have not appreciated at the time, makes this phone special to use now. You may have noticed me glance over the fact that yes, this phone features an FM radio, something you almost never get nowadays. Now with the advent of internet and cheap unlimited data, it's not something that many want or need. But don't worry, the bygone features don't stop there. You may have noticed that the top of the phone features a plastic panel. This isn't just a design touch, although it is gorgeous looking with how it hides the power button, but it's also an IR blaster cover. The awful Peel Remote app no longer works or can be updated, but this app named A Smart Remote works with all my devices. And of course, we have a headphone jack.
HTC was always known for their attention to audio. The M7 came with Beats audio branding, and both devices came with a set of earphones. Unlike the regular SUD that Samsung and Apple would bundle, I remember them sounding rather good. And while Beats branding is gone, this phone came with HTC Boom sound, which is rather awful, so let's switch it off and never talk about it. But generally, the One M8 is by far the best sounding portable device that I own. You see, the Note 4, the Tab S6 Lite, the V30, and even my Asus laptop all feature a sound profile that is basically identical to one another. It's a baseline. But the One M8 does something different. The songs that I've listened to for years, my favourite albums, they all sound different. Maybe it's just a V-curve, or maybe it's the special amp that HTC included alongside the SoC DAC, but the bass response is far tighter. Vocals sound crystal clear, almost a little too exaggerated, and the instrument separation is fantastic, with songs that would normally be muddy on previously mentioned devices opening up. There's also zero hiss or any sort of interference. The DAC allows for up to 32-bit audio at 48 kHz. The audio quality is good enough that you are able to hear the difference between FLACs and MP3s, especially ones that were encoded to a port of standard. And don't just take my word for it, look at what GSM Arena had to say.
In terms of the internal speakers, yeah, technology has really moved on. There is zero bass that comes out of them, they sound flat and lifeless. Apple, Samsung, Google, they all figured out how to do impressive stereo, using the bottom firing speaker for bass and the earpiece speaker for treble. This phone is still somewhat useful in 2023, as it is still supported by many of the most popular apps, as it's running Android 6.0, so you are able to load up PowerAmp or Apple Music for example. And actually I'm surprised by how well this old Snapdragon 801 chipset handles modern apps. Yeah, it's not fast to load apps, bordering on painfully slow, but once the apps load, they're not much slower to operate than on my Galaxy Tab S6 Lite. While this phone only has 16GB of internal storage, it supports microSD XC cards, so you can put in high-capacity cards. Though of course I worry about the future of this phone once apps move on to newer API versions. From the most impressive part of the phone, let's talk about the least impressive. Even back in 2014, the camera on the M8 was awful. The camera is 4 megapixels, as HTC bet on larger pixels rather than sheer resolution. This was done to try and improve low-light performance, but even that was lacking. There's also no image stabilization, as that would throw off the depth camera. So yeah, forget about low-light imagery. While megapixels don't matter in the modern sense, 4 megapixels is and was painfully low. Keep in mind this phone came out in 2014. By 2015, the average person could buy a 4K TV, like that hateful Sony TV that I own that I spoke about in my previous video. 4K, for context, is 8 megapixels, so these images could not even be displayed at full resolution, no, without upscaling. And likewise, you couldn't record 4K video because there were physically not enough pixels to do so. The second issue was that the color science was rather muted and lifeless, but what I did like about this phone, and still do, is the depth camera. You know those cinematic photos that Google Photos creates, where it has to estimate what's in front and what's behind the subject? How about that, but in hardware? When you take a photo, it automatically shoots it with the depth layer, and after the fact, you can choose Dimension Plus and move around the image using the phone's gyro. It's such a cool effect, and I truly wish that a modern equivalent existed. Like the Amazon Fire Phone, this creates a pseudo 3D effect, almost making you feel like you are looking at a little diorama of your image. Of course there's limitations, mainly that the image has to have some depth in the first place. Shooting landscapes will be a pointless affair. The other effects include U-focus, which lets you change focus after the fact, and create a fake DSLR-like blur. Of course, these can be done in software now, and to a better extent even, but in 2014 these solutions didn't exist. We also have Foregrounder, which adds effects to the background of the subject. Again, this can be done in Photoshop with one click, or with third-party apps on iOS, but again it's all built in, and all done in hardware, and done 9 years ago. We can also do some basic double exposures and geometric shapes, which I liked back then, and still do now. We also have Zoe, which takes images from a folder and creates a highlight reel video. I remember the awful placement of Zoe. My mum would always accidentally open it because it looks like the banner of your latest image. The battery life on my unit hasn't deteriorated much at all. At worst, I can get about 5 hours of music listening on Apple Music, which does heat up the device quite a bit, since it's a rather large app for the old CPU. So to explain the title of this video, when this phone came out, the Galaxy S5 was Samsung's latest flagship. With its horrible band-aid looking plastic panel, the fake metal railings, the rear-facing speaker, and the physical home button, HTC was doing something that the biggest players weren't, with this phone feeling years ahead of the competition. But at the same time, this was signaling the end of do-it-all smartphones. This phone already started off the trend of non-removable rear panels in Android phones, and one by one, the features this phone has started being dropped by other manufacturers, like the headphone jack, the IR blaster, microSD card slot, and including earphones in the box. It also signaled the end of HTC's smartphone division.
The One M9, with its infamous Snapdragon 810, wasn't really a great phone, unless you were a fan of your phone overheating. The 10 was HTC's last breath as general consumers weren't all that interested in what HTC was doing, and we lost a player in the smartphone market. And while HTC is still around making phones, they seem to only be available in the Asian market, and with their generic designs, and the fact Google bought HTC's hardware division, I reckon they just rebranded ODM products. As for me, this phone is a keeper, as it makes for an amazing DAP. And once it stops being supported on its ancient Android version, I might even take the plunge and get an M10. Is what I would have said, except I purchased one, it's coming tomorrow. So maybe expect a mini review of that phone too, since from reading user reviews, the audio is a refinement of the M8 and has support for audio. Thanks for watching and hope to see you for another video.